Hey, how are ya? Logic lesson 53, defining words, part 1. Okay, a little bit of review, so make sure you take out your notes. By the way, still missing some homework for some of you. So again, just make sure you hand it in. And I'm missing one test. Landon, where's your test? I need it. Hand it in as soon as you can. Alright, anyway. Let's do a little bit of review from the last lesson. So last lesson we talked about types of disputes. What are the 3 types of disputes? Empirical, definitional, presuppositional. Good job. Some things to think about when you're disputing. What is it when you have the attitude of win at all costs? When the victory when the cost of victory seriously damages the victor. That is called a Pyrrhic victory. By the way, I was looking at that video and it looked like it might have been a little bit hard to see how to spell Pyrrhic. Pyrrhic is spelled Pyrrrhic. Pyrrrhic. So if you don't have it spelled right, you can fix that. The main purpose of logic is not to win arguments, but to discover truth. Sometimes, depending on who you're arguing or having a dispute with, you may have to decide whether or not the dispute is worthwhile, right? Some people just argue just for the fun of it. You're never going to beat them, or at least they're never going to admit that you beat them, right? So sometimes you got to decide. If you just want to have fun, that's fine. But if you want to actually have a meaningful discussion, a meaningful dispute, you may have to decide whether or not it's worth having. All right, what are empirical disputes? What are empirical disputes? They are disputes over facts, right? So, what kind of an empirical dispute is easily resolved by checking the facts? You can just pull out your phone, maybe make a phone call, look something up, the encyclopedia, whatever. What kind are easily resolved by checking the facts? Simple empirical disputes. What kind of empirical disputes involve many complex variables that make its truth difficult to determine? Complex empirical disputes. Excellent. All right, lesson 53, defining words. This is a very important lesson, okay? When you have a discussion, when you have an argument with somebody, many times, the reason you're arguing is because one of you is not understanding what somebody means by a certain term or a certain word that they're using. You have 2 different definitions in your mind about a certain word, okay? And that's why it's absolutely crucial that you define your terms. Define what you mean when you're having a discussion, when you're having an argument. I mean, and we've talked about this, again, equivocation, all of that. But you've probably had an argument where you argued, and then after you got mad, and you fought, and you insulted each other, you realize you actually don't really even disagree that much. It's just that there was a certain term or a certain word or a certain something that the 2 of you were defining differently. You weren't understanding each other correctly. Okay? So that's why it's so important to define your terms. All right. So, one of the most important steps to solving disagreements is to make sure you define terms accurately. Let me read it again. one of the most important steps to solving disagreements is to make sure you define terms accurately. Cool. All right. So again, equivocation, we learned about this. It's a fallacy. But again, it fits into what we're talking about. So equivocation is when someone uses a word in two different ways, but argues as though he is only using one meaning for the word. Okay? So what are some examples of how equivocation can cause misunderstandings? So we talked about possibly hiking Skyline Drive as a class and watching the sunrise. So let's say Mr. Weaver sends out a message, says, all right, everybody, we're going to hike Skyline Drive. The sun comes up at, I don't know, when does the sun come up? 6:45. Make sure you're there early. All right? Hans gets there at 6 o'clock because to him, that's early. He's going to make sure he gets there in time to see the sunrise. Marissa shows up at 6:40 because to her, getting there 5 minutes before I said is early, right? But see, that's two different definitions of the word early, okay? They have two different, I'm not saying that's for real, for sure, but I'm just hypothetically, they have two different definitions of the word early, right? Are there other words? Well, let me use this one. Caleb eats the last brownie, okay? Caleb's mom makes some wonderful brownies. There's two left. Caleb eats them both. All right, his sister comes in. She hasn't gotten one yet. She's mad, starts chasing Caleb around, beating him up. He's like, whoa, stop. I couldn't help it. I had to. And she's like, oh yeah, you really had to. Yes, I couldn't help myself. I had to eat the brownie. And she says, somebody pointed a gun at your head and told you not to eat it. Would you have eaten it? Okay? So that's kind of equivocation. Two different ways of thinking, what does it mean by I had to eat it? Right? I couldn't help myself. It's two different ways of seeing it, right? One way is, the temptation was so great, I just had to do it. The other one was, oh yeah, if you had the right motivation, somebody had a gun to your head, you wouldn't have taken it, right? Anyway, so two different ways. What are some other words that we often, that often have more than one meaning? Okay? And depending how you use it, it can have very different meanings. How about the word love? Okay? If I say, I love mountain biking, that's very different from me saying, I love Mrs. Weaver. Okay? Same word, two very different meanings. Alright? I will not die for mountain biking. I would die for Mrs. Weaver. Right? So, anyway, how about the word cheap? Somebody says, that thing's cheap. What are two different words, two different meanings to the word cheap? Let's think about, he bought a cheap car. What do we mean? Or his car was cheap, put it that way. So somebody says his car was cheap. What are the two different meanings that the word cheap could have? It could mean inexpensive, right? Like it was literally inexpensive. Like he got a good deal. He paid half of what the car was worth. All right? That could be one meaning. The other meaning that cheap has come to mean is, well, it's actually not a very good car. It's cheap. It's inexpensive, but it's also like a piece of junk, right? So those are two. And you have to make sure you know what you're saying, what you're talking about. That you have to make sure the other person knows what you mean. And if you're confused about what someone else says, you have to know what they mean. Another one is the word starving, right? The other day, one of our kids told Mrs. Weaver that he's starving. Mrs. Weaver showed him a picture of a kid on the internet who was truly starving. She said, you're not starving. Okay? But we use that in two different ways. Sometimes we say people are starving. We really actually mean they are genuinely dying from starvation, right? But half the time when we use the word starving, we just mean we're really hungry. Okay, we're not starving. Okay, different meanings. So I saw this comic where Nancy Pelosi says, Trump is always in my prayers. And then it has another picture of her down on her knees praying, and she says, "Dear God, please help us destroy Trump before the 2020 election." Okay, that's an example of equivocation where you're misleading people by meaning something different, right? Yeah, she's praying for him, but not exactly the way you would think, right? Okay. So we must define our terms. What are the rules of definition? I'm going to write them down. I want you to follow along and write these down. What are the rules for definitions? Numero uno. Actually, let's write down rules for definitions. Rule one. As much as possible, the definition should contain the essential primary characteristics. Contain the essential primary characteristics of a term. Okay. So, it needs to have the essentials. Alright? You can't leave things out that are important. So if I say something like, if I'm defining a vehicle, if I say a machine with 4 wheels, is that really a vehicle? Well, it is, but it's actually too precise, right? So I only want the essentials. Okay, just the essentials. So a proper definition of a vehicle is more like a thing used for transporting goods or people. That could be many things, right? But any kind of a thing used for transporting goods or people is technically a vehicle. It doesn't have to have wheels. Okay? So you need the essentials. But don't put more details than what you should have, because then you are misdefining the thing. Rule 2. Definitions should not be circular. Okay, definitions should not be circular. By the way, let me just read over number 1 again to make sure you get it. As much as possible, the definitions should contain the essential primary characteristics of a term. As much as possible, the definition should contain the essential primary characteristics of a term. Okay? Rule 2, definitions should not be circular. And we talked about circular reasoning before. Don't define a word using the word itself. Don't define a word using the word itself. Okay? So if I say something like An addict is somebody who is addicted to something. Okay? That's a circular definition. It's not helping you. Okay? It's just using the same word. A hunter is somebody who loves to hunt. That's a circular definition. You don't use the same word, even if it's a different form, to define the word itself. Okay, let's do the next one. Rule 3, definitions should not be too broad or narrow. Okay, definitions should not be too broad or narrow. So if I say, how are you going to define a woman? Okay, define the word woman. If you say somebody who has long hair, does every woman have long hair? No, so you can't use that as a definition. So if I say it's a female, is that a good definition of a woman? No, because there are female dogs, right? There are female horses, and they're not women, right? So the one definition, she has long hair, that's too narrow, because some women don't have long hair. The word female is too broad, because there are other females besides women, right? So you would have to say something like an adult female person, okay? An adult female person, and that gets to that makes the definition much more precise, right? Because a woman is an adult, and they're female, and they're a person, a human being. Okay, good. All right, so that's rule 3. Rule 4. Definitions should prefer positive comparisons to negative ones. Definitions should prefer positive comparisons to negative ones. Okay, so if you're trying to define something by comparing, you want to give a positive comparison, not a negative comparison, if at all possible. All right, so if I say a car is a vehicle that's not a truck, is that really a good definition? Again, no, because there's more vehicles besides vehicles that are not trucks, but that also aren't cars. Okay, you could have a motorcycle, you have a train, you have a helicopter. There's other vehicles besides vehicles that are not trucks that are also not cars. So I can't just say a car is a vehicle that's not a truck. Now, however, there are some exceptions to this. If something is primarily defined by what it is not, then that's an exception to this rule. Okay? So if I say the definition of a pacifist is someone who does not believe in going to war. Now, in that case, that's a negative comparison, but it works because that is what a pacifist is. The identity of a pacifist rests on what they are not. They do not believe in going to war, right? Even something like the word lie. What is a lie? A lie is a statement that is not true. So the identity of the word lie rests in what it is not. Okay? So those are exceptions. Rule 5. Definitions should be clear. Okay, so yeah, that's a pretty straightforward one, right? So that one kind of goes without saying. you got to make your definitions clear. They got to make sense. Okay? Don't make them ambiguous. Again, there are certain words that are more ambiguous, so you have to clarify them. So we talked about the word early. What do we mean by that? So Hans had a different definition than Marissa. So Mr. Weaver can't just say be there early. I've got to define what I mean. I got to say I want you there 30 minutes early so we can get there and hike to the top and still see the sunrise, right? I can't just say you got to be there early and expect you guys to all have the same definition of early. I once dealt with a man who had an extreme anger problem. I mean, it was extreme. The guy he would get ferociously angry about things. And when people would confront him about this, he would say, "Oh, I'm not angry. I just have a very intense personality. I'm just an intense person." And somebody asked me about that once, and they're like, "Is that true? Like, is he actually angry, or is he just an intense person?" And I was like, if he's not angry, then we need to really change the definition of anger, because he gets really angry. And if that's not anger, then I don't know what is, right? So again, people sometimes have different definitions for words, right? Let me erase these. Rule 6. Definitions should avoid emotive language. What do we mean by emotive language? So again, the root word would be emotion, kind of this overbearing, emotional, sort of emotionally manipulative language. Arguments should stay away from that. Okay, so language that manipulates through unfair emotional tactics. So yeah, just really strong, kind of overbearing. So something like, if I'm not a big fan of Democrats for the most part, right? I mean, there are some Democrats that are better than others, but I'm not a big fan. But what if my definition of Democrat was something like a power-hungry tyrant who loves to kill babies? That's not really a fair definition of the word Democrat, right? That's this kind of overly emotional, manipulative, and it lumps them all into this category. And so if I come to you and if we're going to have a discussion about, are Democrats decent people, or do they have any good or whatever, if we're having a discussion about that and I start out the conversation that way, it just kind of ends it. There's not really a discussion to be had, because I just, use this emotionally manipulative language that doesn't really get us anywhere. I'm not really dealing with objective facts. Not every Democrat loves to kill babies. Most of them probably don't, even though they support the idea, right? But the point is, I need to be careful that I don't use emotive language. Rule 7. Definitions should define the terms as the correct part of speech. definitions should define the term as the correct part of speech. So if I'm defining the word scold, and I say a lecture intended to improve someone's behavior. Okay, I'm defining the word scold. And I say a lecture intended to improve someone's behavior. If you scold somebody, what part of speech is that? It's a verb, right? Scolding is a verb. Well, if you scold, that's a verb. A scolding could be a noun, but if you scold, that's a verb, right? But if I define it as a lecture to improve someone's behavior, I just change the definition to the definition of a noun. Okay? So you're messing with the word when you do that. So don't change the part of speech. Often when we use the word when at the beginning of a definition, it changes the part of speech. Okay? So if I say, I'm defining a table, and I say when you have a piece of furniture that with a flat top and legs. I'm changing the part of speech of the table. Okay? I don't need to put the word when in front of it. When you have a piece of furniture with flat top and legs. Okay? So be careful about using the word when. Sometimes the word when can start a definition if you're talking about an adverb or something like that. Occasionally you use the word when to begin the definition, but most of the time if you use the word when, you're changing the part of speech. So try not to use that. Alright? Don't change the part of speech. Don't do it! Alright. That's all I got for today's lesson. I want you to read pages 249 to 254 and then answer the questions on page 254. Alright? Again, keep handing that work in. Landon, I need your test. All right. Have a good one.